September the 19th, 2014 was an historic day for Scotland. It was the day we found out the electorate voted against independence, the day which signalled the beginning of a whole new political landscape north of the border. 6 months on, and with less than 50 days to go until a general election, here's how events have unfolded since the referendum. This report contains flash photography. Was it really 6 months ago? The vote lasted only a day. The official declaration was over in minutes, the endgame of a prolonged campaign which energised some and filled others with a sense of dread.
The people of Scotland have spoken.
The legacy of this period is still being written. What we know is that the 18th of September, whilst an end in itself, also gave birth to potentially the most exciting period in this country's politics. When Scotland voted no, there were bound to be casualties.
As leader, my time is nearly over. But for Scotland, the campaign continues, and the dream shall never die.
Exit one stage, ready for the next, destination Westminster. Within weeks of that resignation, there was the Smith Commission. Cross-party, it forged a consensus of sorts. More powers now look likely. Less certain is whether voters torn in September but opting for no regard this process as job done. From the vortex of the referendum came a shattering of the old certainties. Once a marginal force with the revolutionary threat of the White Heather Club, the SNP, are now a mass membership party.
Power over Scotland doesn't lie with Westminster anymore. It lies in the hands of the Scottish people, and that is where it is going to stay.
Tens of thousands of new troops. But will they obediently adopt Nicola Sturgeon's pathway to independence or insist that a new route is sought? And from victory in the referendum, Scottish Labour imploded. Jim Murphy replaced Joanne Lamont, she scunnered by the party down south. Many heartland voters embraced the Yes campaign. Now they back the SNP, threatening an electoral meltdown of near unimaginable proportions.
I would like to invite all Scots, regardless of politics or regardless of referendum, to work together in this great land of ours with a sense of pride.
All these events now shape a debate that will produce a judgment on the 7th of May. 16 years after devolution, the Scottish question is different, but still troublesome for Westminster. The Scottish Assembly issue dominated the parliaments from 1974 to 79. Then the government's majority, hung by a thread, was lost, only for Labour to be propped up by a pact before the failure to deliver the 1978 devolution bill finished it off. Are we in for a rerun? Watch this space. Well, I'm joined now by Alex Salmond, MSP, who has a new book out today called The Dream Shall Never Die, which focuses on the time of the independence referendum campaign. Alex Salmond, thank you very much for joining us. Before we look forward, let's look back. And you spend quite a lot of time in this book, in a sense, venting your frustration at the inability to get some messages across because what you perceived to be bias, even in broadcasting, and quite a lot of it is in relation to the BBC. But, you know, Mrs Thatcher went to war with the BBC, Harold Wilson had his gripes with the BBC. Is this just not another politician unhappy with the BBC?
No, I'm not at war. I'm just telling the truth. And I thought in the campaign, and it was unexpected because I thought that during the referendum campaign itself that broadcasting would be impartial, and I think STV was, and I say so in the book. But I think the BBC turned from being a public service broadcaster into effectively a state broadcaster. And I don't blame individual journalists. I mean, I list what I think are outstanding individual journalists, Brian Taylor, James Cook, and from the network, David Dimbleby, and a number of others. It's much more an institutional thing. And basically what was happening is, particularly in the latter stages of the campaign, the BBC heavyweights were coming up from London and repeating the No campaign scare stories and fear-mongering, some of which was months old, as if it was new information. And the balance they were giving the Yes campaign was to respond to the latest scaremongering story. Now, that's not balance. I mean, if I say to you, look, Scotland is going to be swallowed up by fire and brimstone, says the No campaign. Here's an equal amount of time, 20 seconds, for a Yes campaigner to say, no, we're not going to be swallowed up by fire and brimstone. So I think the BBC role in the referendum didn't do them any credit, which is why I say it's...
The charge of a state broadcaster is quite a serious one, because it almost presupposes that in actual fact people are being directed to completely and suborn the democratic process. And yet when STV indeed interviewed the chief executive of Yes Scotland, Blair Jenkins, who's been a senior executive at this station and a senior executive at the BBC, he said, yes, of course, during the course of the referendum, I had issues with the way in which the BBC approached this, but he rejected the charge of state broadcaster, and he rejected the charge of systemic bias.
Well, can I just point out the one serious piece of academic research which was done in this tended to uphold my view on it. But, you know, Blair's a more generous person than I am. I'm commenting, I mean, I'm not whining and moaning about it, I'm just stating what I saw in the campaign, and what, of course, many, many thousands of people, including those spontaneously demonstrating outside the BBC, saw themselves during the campaign, and I thought it was a significant factor. But listen, you know, as I make the point in the book, you know, the Yes side are not downhearted. We lost the referendum, but you know, you can lose a battle and win a war politically, and it looks like those who lost the referendum are now winning the political war.
We'll come on to what happens now in just a moment, but just one more question. In the past, I mean, I was following this every day, every twist and turn. I sometimes ask myself, do these guys ever have any time to sleep? Never mind think about what to do. You've had 6 months to think and to look back. With hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently? Is there anything that you regret?
Oh, a couple of things. One, I think, I mean, if I misjudged the BBC conduct in the campaign, I also misjudged the London Treasury. I didn't realise fully that the head of the London Treasury, a civil servant, would, as he said in a speech in January, announce that Her Majesty's Treasury is a unionist institution. The clue is in the name, as he said now, meaning Her Majesty. And of course, the monarchy is not a unionist institution. The monarchy was in business 100 years when Scotland was an independent country. So I probably underrated the extent of the overt bias, and that the Treasury would behave unlike, for example, the Bank of England, who I think behaved in an impeccable way. So that was one aspect which I think underrated. But the real lesson I would take from the campaign is we should have got on quicker onto the strongest ground for the Yes campaign, which was on the social and economic agenda, particularly on the health service. And as we got on to the sort of Scotland we were seeking, you know, a Scotland of where public services would be protected, where people would get an equal shout and an equal chance in society, that's what ignited the Yes campaign. And I think we probably, and perhaps it's a media thing, but perhaps it was our mistake as well, and my mistake therefore, we should have forced the agenda quicker onto that ground, as opposed to just responding to every ridiculous scare story or fear-mongering attempt from the No campaign. And once we did that, towards late July, early August, then the Yes campaign started to motor forward in a very formidable way.
OK, well, let's look forward. That little package was saying, you know, back in 1974, the Scottish question dominated the two parliaments.
That, you realise that.
Dominated the two parliaments,
left.
minority Labour government at the end of the day. And, of course, the SNP had many strategic questions during that parliament that it had to face. I mean, there's almost an uncanny echo from 74 to 79. So how should the SNP play a balanced Parliament if that's the result we get at Westminster?
Well, I think Nicola Sturgeon's laid this out extremely well. It made Ed Miliband's declaration of no coalition all the more curious, since Nicola had already said it was extremely unlikely. What is possible is a confidence and supply arrangement. What is probable is a vote-by-vote approach to supporting a minority Labour government. You know, nothing is certain in politics, but there's a reasonable likelihood. If David Cameron couldn't beat Gordon Brown in 2010, it's unlikely to win an overall majority in 2015. And Ed Miliband is just unlikely to win an overall majority. Therefore, that looks like that Scotland might have a position of astonishing influence in this next Westminster Parliament, far more than the 11 SNP members had in the Parliament of 1974 to 1979. And the question and the strategy that Nicola has been outlining is to use that influence to Scotland's benefit, to advance the cause of Scotland, to make sure the promises that were made to us are redeemed in full, in their proper version of last autumn, not the anemic formulation of this spring, and to progress the cause of progressive politics and social justice across these islands. That's a formidable campaign strategy.
Do you think that the SNP and Labour can genuinely work together? Because, you know, politics is very tribal, and the activists at the level of these two parties don't have a lot of time for one another, although I suspect the people that vote both for Labour and the SNP take a lot less tribal analysis of their politics. So, in a sense, do you have to be guided by the voters rather than the activist class? Because the activist class, let's face it, they hate one another.
Well, I think being guided by the voters is never a bad thing in terms of the political direction. And you're quite right to point to poll after poll which says that the preference of the people of Scotland is to see the SNP and the Labour Party working cooperatively. And remember, these are polls which show a widening gap between the SNP and the Labour Party in the last few weeks. The Unison Survation poll out today, for example, we're talking about a gap of 20 points, and these same polls say that when people are asked what's your favoured option, they want to see substantial Scottish influence, they want to see a huge block of SNP tartan benches in the House of Commons, and they want to see that group cooperating with the Labour Party to force forward progressive politics. So listening to the voice of the people is not a bad idea in current circumstances.
And very, very briefly, who knows where the constitutional question will next go? Do you think that you will see? Do you think you will see another independence referendum and a yes vote in your lifetime?
Yes, and I think there's two big things have emerged in this referendum. One is the energisation of the Scottish people. We are not the same nation as we were a year ago. The referendum has changed Scotland and changed it for the better. And secondly, as Nicola Sturgeon has also said, the route to independence, the gold standard of how you get to independence, is now decided. You have to have a majority in the Scottish Parliament with party or parties committed to a referendum, conduct a referendum, and then the Scottish people will decide.
Alex Salmond, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight.